The Jedi Order, the light of the galaxy. For tens of thousands of years, the Jedi Knights have been the guardians of peace and justice in the Republic. This was their identity for as long as anyone can remember. Their hope and guidance led the galaxy into periods of unparalleled peace, often at the cost of balance within their very own order. But rest assured, anytime the Republic needed their help, the Jedi were always there to answer. All innocence would be protected, all wrongs righted, and all injustices avenged. They were the watchful sentinels of the galactic civilization and the keepers of peace. But there was a time before the Jedi stood guard for the Galactic Republic. There was a time long ago when they were humble monks on a quest to discover the true meaning of the Force, its greater mystery. Before they were ever warriors, before they ever solely served the light. It was long periods of trials, tribulations, and eventually, war. New discoveries, before they decided the fate of their order would be changed forever. Welcome back, students of the Force, to our brand new documentary. Out of the many histories to be explored, it is finally time for us to tell the story of how the Jedi Order began. Explore how they became the guardians of the Republic that we know them as for so long. In this video, we will be cataloging the entire 11,500 year period for the moment that they were brought to Tython, to the moment that the Jedi pledged themselves to serve the Republic. This is the dawn of the Jedi. This is how the light awakens, a long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away. Chapter 1. The Tho Yor Arrival. The year is 36,453 BBY. The galaxy has just exited its primordial era, and all of the species are still young and developing. Individual civilizations exist isolated on each planet, as hyperspace technology has not yet been invented. But one strange phenomenon has taken place on 8 separate worlds. Long ago, odd pyramid-shaped starships inexplicitly arrived and lay dormant for millennia. These were known as the Tho Yor. These ships were made of an unknown material and were covered with strange markings that no species could decipher. However, they were powerful with the Force, and they drew intrigue for all who laid eyes upon them. While the makers of the Tho Yor are unknown, it is speculated that it was the Celestials that had their hand in creation. But our story actually begins on the snow-covered mid-rim world of Ando Prime. Here, the Order of the Dai Bendu reside. Though limited in their understanding, they were wise in the ways of the Force. In fact, they were said to be the first race to discover the existence of midichlorians. Importantly, much of the culture of the Jedi comes from the foundation laid before by the Dai Bendu. Every year, the Dai Bendu scale the snowy Andambi mountain to attend the Tho Yor, to meditate upon it. It has nestled itself there in the mountain range for a very long time. The monks knew the Tho Yor was not of their world, but they could perceive that it was powerful in the Force, and thus they were connected to it. They sensed that within the sealed structure, great mysteries were waiting to be revealed. And so the Dai Bendu would meditate at the structure, contemplate the Force and their destiny within it, until one day, when the Tho Yor spoke. A voice, imperceivable to the ear, echoed out through the Force itself. The voice issued the Dai Bendu an invitation. At the same time, the door to the Tho Yor opened and accepted all who would enter. The ship rose from the mountain peak and departed the world of Ando Prime. Elsewhere across the galaxy, the 7 other Tho Yor did the same for the inhabitants of their planets. On each one of these worlds, the native races had their own understanding of the Force, and yet, so many unanswered questions. That was, until the Tho Yor activated there as well. One of the first to hear it would be the Wookiee mystics of the world of Kashyyyk. Hear it calling to them, hearing the hum of the light side, the hum of peace. On the world of Dathomir, the shamans and seers that predated even the Night Sisters heard the call as well. They experienced it in dreams and visions. The Twi'lek philosophers of Ryloth often debated the source of the living energy that surrounded the Tho Yor and the galaxy itself. And when the Tho Yor activated in their desert world and called to them, they instinctively knew the answer to their questions would lay within it. In the oceans of Manan, the Selkath scientists paused their studies as the doors of the great Tho Yor opened, revealing its deep wisdom. The pyramid ships would then travel to many other worlds along their way, picking up many species. This would include humans, Iktachi, Cathar, Zabrak, Miraluka, Deveronians, Krivaki, and many more. They would even pick up the species of the Sith purebloods from the world of Korriban. for the possibility of light and balance still resisted within the purebloods, and once they had gathered enough sentience, the Tho Yor ferried all species towards the center of the galaxy. Traveling through hyperspace, the Tho Yor navigated the strange anomalies of the deep core to reach its final destination. Waiting for them on the force-wealthy planet of Tython was the 9th, final, and the largest of the Tho Yor. The planet of Tython was extremely sensitive to the Force, and with the arrival of all these beings who carried with it, rich within themselves, the planet heralded the arrival with great storms of power. Now that they had been brought to their new home, these people from distant cultures and planets all came together as Tythons, and this event would become known as the First Great Migration, or the Tho Yor Arrival. The first calendar used by the Tythons would actually be based on the Tho Yor arrival, and it was abbreviated to TYA. Tython was a lush, beautiful world with a great variety of climates and ecology. A lot of it was covered in forest and jungles, but there were also volcanoes, deserts, and plains. Plains filled with rising plateaus, mesmerizing rock formations. They quickly discerned that their purpose in this place was to study the Force, to master the abilities given to them. They didn't know why this had all happened, but none of them questioned it. They decided to pay no heed to the past or to the future, but to remain grounded in the present, where balance in the Force was maintained. But truly knowing the Force would require far more than just sitting in contemplation. They learned how to practice a sort of moving meditation, having the Force rush through them as they entered a flow state, allowing the Force to dictate their actions, truly manifesting it from within. Over the next 1,000 years, the Tythons built a great civilization, establishing temples, cities, places of learning, and healing, all of them centered around the 9 Tho Yor ships, which had come to settle in various places around the world. Upon observing the world around them, they saw 2 moons in the sky, light, Ashla, and dark, Bogan, which taught them the dual aspects of the Force. The light defined the dark as the dark did the light, and while contemplating this, they attempted to tame these wilds of Tython, but this would prove to be a beast all its own. The planet was so strong with the Force that if perfect balance was not maintained upon it, it would react with violent storms, and worse, earthquakes. It wasn't just the natural disasters that provided threats either, but Tython's fauna contained many large and dangerous predators. This gave the Tythons both practice in combat and in reaching out to creatures through the living force. And so the Tythons defined themselves as a people ever seeking a great balance, for on their world, balance meant peace and safety. And to this end, they called themselves the Jedi, taking from 2 Dai Bendu words, those words being mystic and center. They determined that only through the harmony of balance could the Jedi maintain a peaceful planet. Those born with the ability to touch the Force were brought back to Tython, and they would pass from one temple to another, seeking knowledge and balance. But not all those who came with them on the Tho Yor, and not every child born of the Jedi was a Force sensitive. And as such, they were at the mercy of the strict planet, and not even the Jedi could protect them. During one of Tython's severe lashouts, the city of Arum was utterly destroyed, and from that moment forward, it was made clear that Tython was simply too dangerous for those that could not touch the Force. And so, during the 2nd millennium that they were there, a 2nd migration would take place. All the Tythons who were not Jedi would depart. This was a time of great sorrow. Families were torn apart, but this was also a time of great necessity. These people would go out. They would settle the worlds in the Tytho system. They settled on the planets of Ashla and Bogan before leaving to colonize other worlds. Including Tython, there were a total of 11 planets in the system for the settlers to venture to, and these planets were where the Jedi would get their start in keeping peace. From the nearest to the star Tythos to the furthest, these were the planets. Sunspot and Maltera are 2 small worlds that rotate in opposite directions around the star. When the 2 planets pass one another in their near orbits, both worlds experience violent storms. While they were far too hot to actually live on, they were very useful for mining operations due to valuable ores that could be found within. To this end, Sentience made a great use of envirosuits to make brief but important excavation trips. The next world in the system is known as Nox, and it ended up becoming an industrial planet. They focused on the manufacturing of products which were very hazardous to the environment. As a result, over the next several centuries, it got so polluted that its cities must be sheltered under domes supplied with filtered air. The next planet is known as the Ur, which is an arid world pocket-marked by its inactive volcanoes. The atmosphere here is so hot and the surface is so dry that no unprotected life can survive for very long at all. The only thing that grows there are strange kind of blue crystals and tall spires of glass. But lying underground is an enormous network of caverns and lakes. Within these caverns, an entire ecosystem is able to live and thrive. The moisture trapped there allows rain to fall within the caverns, giving life to alien plants and underworld jungles. Tython is the 5th planet from Tythos, and behind it is the world of Kalamar, a cosmopolitan world with a very large population. One may even say that Kalamar is like Tythos' own Coruscant, only it wasn't covered in a planet-wide city. Kalamar was the first planet colonized after Tython, and this is one of the most densely populated of the entire worlds in the sector. Because of this, it also has the business and the religious hub for the entire system of Tython. Here, they had beautifully crafted cities of white metal comprised of tall spires. They preserved the natural land as well, building their own cities on green hillsides in front of gorgeous mountain scenery. Shikakwa is a largely aquatic world ruled by the feudal gangster clans. The 9 houses, as they are known, are headed by an aristocracy who rules the land and interests of Shikakwa. For the longest time, the houses all answered to a single overlord known as Kral. Ska-Gora is the next planet, a temperate green world almost completely made up of forests and swamp. In an effort to preserve the planet's lively wilderness, almost all of the planet's population live in floating city ships very similar to how the Ithorians live. Apparently though, some Wookiees have illegally colonized the forests of this world, and no one has challenged their claim to it. Next up are the planets of Oberi and Mar, which are 2 gas giants in the system that each boast having several moons. The colonists have populated many of these moons and have set up many gas mining facilities within the atmospheres of the giants. And finally, the outermost world in the Tythos system is Fury's Gate. The world is mostly barren, with the only inhabitants being those that live on a single scientific outpost. There, you can find an observatory that watches the rest of the deep core called the Fury Station, which is a space station that orbits the planet. Although these planets were largely independent, the Jedi would interfere whenever it was requested of them, but sometimes they would intervene without request if the Force had directed them to. Keeping balance became something that felt very important to them everywhere they went, not just Tython. Over the centuries, the settlers somewhat forgot about their ancestry, the world of Tython, and the Jedi, and as a result, these strange monks became mysterious and even feared figures of legend. But now that we've established the setting for which the Jedi Order existed, it's now time for us to talk about the Order itself. The Jedi always prided themselves on the structure, discipline, and the culture of temple life, so let's observe what it looked like in their ancient past, before they were the Jedi. Chapter 2, Life on Tython. There is no ignorance, there is knowledge, there is no fear, there is power. I am the heart of the Force. I am the revealing fire of light. I am the mystery of the darkness, in balance with chaos and harmony, immortal in the Force. This was the code of the ancient Jedi Order. It perfectly represented their desire to forever remain in the balance between light and dark, or what they called Ashla and the Bogan. In the Jedi philosophy, they acknowledged the fact that there was always a light within the darkness, and a darkness within the light, so that it was impossible for one to ever truly be free of either. In fact, the ancient Jedi were encouraged to give in to the temptations of both light and dark, as they believed it was necessary to embrace both in order to learn more about the whole of the Force. The light brought peace, clarity, serenity, life, and logic. However, ebbing too far to the Ashla could cause one to become rigid, cold, and mired in indecision. The dark brought emotions that spur one to actions such as passion, pain, and anger. They did not believe these things to be harmful when used properly though, and the Jedi claimed that anger could cleanse like fire could. But if one only felt anger, then they would be out of balance, and they would be incapable of showing forgiveness or compassion. They used the light and the dark in tandem to save the lives of both innocents, themselves, and their enemies. The Jedi believed that restoring all things to balance was their purpose, and that was their singular goal to keep in mind when facing an enemy. Mercy should be taken at every opportunity, but if there was no other way, then they may destroy an enemy to restore the balance. In the beginning, they lived a monolithic lifestyle as scholars, builders, and artists. Combat was really the furthest thing from their mind until it became something that needed to protect them. To protect the weak even, the innocents from the dangers of the galaxy. And to this end, they believed that each of their number should be fully armed with the Force as their ally, and the temperance of their guide. The very first thing to talk about when it comes to life on ancient Tython was the 9 different separate temples. The entire life of the young Jedi surrounded these temples, with each one being crafted from 1 or 2 of the Tho Yor, and each of them representing a different field of study. The way the Jedi initiates actually progressed through their studies was not always under one specific master, at least, not for very long, but by going on a personalized journey through each and every temple. You would start at one, and then once you graduated, you would move on to the next until you graduated from all of them. This wasn't a requirement though. Some Jedi chose to remain at any of one of these temples and specialize in whatever subject the temple centered around. But by and large, they were expected to visit all of them before making a decision on whether they wanted to stay at one specific temple. These are each of the temples that we know of. The first was known as Calith, the Temple of Knowledge. This one was perched over a Force Nexus, and this is where the Jedi gathered as a whole when important tasks came at hand. It was here where they first founded the Great Library, and it was here that decisions are made on behalf of the entire Order. While the official High Council did not exist yet, each of the headmasters of every temple would come together as representatives of each part of Tython in order to form what is called as the Master's Council, and it was here on Calith where they would meet. The next temple is known as Bodhi, the Temple of the Arts. This was located on the Grain Plains near the Pleasant Forests. This is where students and masters study the Force as manifested through the arts such as writing, dancing, calligraphy, drawing, sculpting, cooking, music, and even theater. This truly characterizes how the original Jedi were. If you think about it, the Jedi were comprised of all different types of species, so it only makes sense that the Order would be very rich with all kinds of culture. While they had a collective identity of being students of the Force, they still appreciated the traditions of their ancestry. They understood that the Force manifested itself through lifestyle and art, and so chose to have an entire temple devoted to this. Anilkesh was the Temple of Science. Here is where the Jedi scientists plumb the mysteries of Force alchemy. The emphasis is on the theoretical, but the results are often practical and sometimes dangerous. This place straddled the chasm, a gorge so deep that no one has ever found the bottom of it. Something within the chasm interferes with the senses of Force sensitives. In fact, the stronger in the Force one was, and the deeper they went into the chasm, the worse the interference would become. The chasm represents the unsolvable mysteries of the Force, and some Jedi scientists have gone mad trying to learn the chasm's dark secrets. This was why the Temple of Science had to be built over it, since that was a place of discovery amidst confusion. Maharakesh was the Temple of Healing. This one is located on the deep ocean, with great portions of it extending underwater. The focus here is, as the name suggests, the healing arts, both with and without the Force. The ways of healing were a special interest of many ancient Jedi. After all, the Force itself was life incarnate. Therefore, it could be used for the pursuit of bringing balance, maintaining balance in that life. While they understood that death was a natural part of it, they believed that it was their duty to ensure that unnecessary death never befalls those around them. And so they trained their students to heal others with both the Force, and those that had a talent with it would develop medicine. Then you have the Vertep, the Forge. This temple lies directly over an active volcano, and it utilizes the heat of the magma to provide the power to the entire structure. The emphasis of the study of the Vertep is one of practical, and how the Force can be manifest physically. This is where they crafted their gear, specifically their metal swords. Swords that we'll go more in depth about briefly here. Next, you have the Qigong Cache, which was a temple of Force skill. This was located in the Silent Desert, and this is where many students honed their mental and their sensory abilities. This place was actually the perfect for students focusing on their own mental power. The Silent Desert is named so because all sound dies there due to some undiscovered element of the sand. Sound waves are somehow absorbed into the sand directly, rendering it completely quiet for miles upon miles around the temple, making it the perfect place to study and train. In the cold and the snowy mountains, we have Stavkash, which was the temple of martial arts. This is the temple where the Jedi learned to fight, both in hand-to-hand combat training and with their swords, in order to learn how to manipulate the Force within their bodies to protect the weak. This is where they became the legendary warriors that the galaxy would come to know them as. But before the days of the 7 forms of lightsaber combat, their dueling looked very different. While unfortunately we don't have a lot of information of what their sword training was actually like, we do know of the martial exercises that they performed. Their form was called Alchaka, and it was a vigorous style that some of the Jedi jokingly claim was invented just to keep warm on the mountaintops. The Alchaka meditations were a rigorous series of highly personal, repetitive exercising uses both physical and Force skills at once. It consisted of a high number of repetitions and dizzying movements performed in complex positions. Completing the meditations correctly typically left the practitioner on the brink of exhaustion. The purpose of Alchaka was to serve as a type of moving meditation, to clear the mind and attune the body to the strength of the Force. And now we reach Padawan Kesh, the Jedi Academy. At this temple was where the very young initiates were housed and taught until their formal training under a Jedi Master. And that name, Padawan, has lasted throughout the Jedi Order's history. And finally, we have Akarkesh, the Temple of Balance. Above the towering pinnacle of Tython floats the largest of the Tho Yor, the original Tho Yor. It was valued as a place of introspective contemplation. Here, the balancing of the light and dark sides of the Force was taught. The balance of the Ashla and the Bogan was so important to the Jedi that they forbade their members from falling too far to either side. In fact, when a Jedi fell too far into the light, they were banished to Ashla to meditate on the moon of Bogan. And of course, if you were to fall too far into the dark, they were banished to Bogan to meditate on Ashla. This was because both moons were always in sight of one another, so the prisoners could contemplate while gazing upon the opposite moon that they needed to strive towards a balance. Once the Jedi Masters reevaluated the banished Jedi and determined that they had achieved balance, they were allowed to return to Tython. These were all of the temples found on Tython. But what about the ranking system of the Jedi Order, and how it differed from modern Jedi? Beginners started as initiates at Padawan Kesh. This is the first rank, where they were raised in the ways of the Force until they reached adolescence, where they would then be selected by a master to be trained as an apprentice. There were two ways that they could be trained, either directly at Padawan Kesh or around Tython, depending on the master's teaching style. Once the master felt that the student was ready and had completed their training, the Jedi would be promoted to a journeyer. This was sometime during their teenage years. It was here where they would undertake the Great Journey, which was the odyssey that took them across Tython to the rest of the 9 temples that we mentioned. This trek would be taken alone and largely by foot, and it wasn't just about gaining knowledge, but finding one's own self and place within the Force. Great journeys typically lasted only 2 years, but could be much longer depending on the progress or the aptitude of the journeyer. It's also usually during this time of learning and introspection that the Jedi would select what discipline they wanted to devote their lives to. Upon a successful completion of a great journey, they were elevated to the rank of a Jedi Ranger. This was the equivalent of a Jedi Knight in rank. It came with much privilege, prestige, and duty. Rangers were deployed across the Tython system to take care of assignments given to them by the Council, or to intervene with planets that needed their aid, whether by request or by the will of the Force. Because of their constant work in keeping the peace either through diplomacy, ending conflicts, hunting fugitives, or helping impoverished civilizations, some Rangers rarely ever returned to their homeworld of Tython. Some stayed on the move, and others would make their home on the planets or moons in the system. But if a Jedi Ranger had shown a sufficient amount of wisdom, experience, and an understanding of the Force, they would be promoted to the rank of Master. And it was here where they would often make their homes at one of the temples to teach the next generation of Jedi. The path of the Jedi was laid out pretty plainly, and along that way, they would have to do what every other follower of the light has to eventually do. That is, craft their weapon. Earlier, we mentioned their metal swords, which was a staple of the Order around this era. Much like the ancient Sith, the Jedi used Force alchemy to imbue their weapons with the Force itself. It was an important step in their journey to visit the Vertept Forge, to partake in the ceremony of crafting their blade. The forging process went something like this. An initiate would send a bar of high-carbon metal. For a while, this was just Durasteel, but later on, the Jedi began to use more of an alloy that they referred to as Mad Dog Steel. This was named after the Vertept's headmaster, Tem Mad Dog, who chemically created a blade of steel that was so durable that it was thought to be unbreakable. They would then hammer this from a bar into a blade, and all the while it was being forged, the Force was channeled into the blade by the user, altering the molecular structure of the metal into a refined lattice, both to further harden the blade and sharpen its edge without the need for any grindstone. Once the blade was forged, the initiate would place a crystal in the hilt of the blade. We have some sources to suggest that the Jedi did not use kyber crystals back in this day. While they hadn't yet discovered the living nature of the crystals, they were aware of their power in the Force and did use them in their blades. To accomplish this, they would submerge themselves in deep meditation, pouring the Force into the blade itself and the crystal until they married all of it together, metal and crystal as one. Once it was finished, the wielder would channel the Force through the sword until it would begin to glow with a misty energy, indicating that the blade had been permanently infused with the Force. Despite not being lightsabers, crafting these swords was no less of an extremely personal process. The blades were also very powerful themselves, sharp enough to cut through almost anything. This further required a trained and a steady hand from the Jedi wielder, one flowing with the Force. Yet their use of alchemy did not stop at the creation of swords. At the Temple of Anil Kesh, the Jedi also performed alchemy on creatures, genetically manipulating them to serve the Force. We know that many years in the future, the Jedi would consider this to be a twisting of life, and therefore would go against everything they stood for. But for the Jedi, before the Jedi Order, they were still discovering how the Force worked and functioned. They did not know what they were doing, but at the very least, they did not dip too much into the dark side and actually use Sith alchemy. Their alchemy was more pure. Unfortunately, many of their methods have since been lost to time, but we are aware of them having created and trained Rancors with wings known as Rancor dragons. But despite being in an age of swords and sorcery, the Jedi had access to a variety of technologies as well. They still had communicators and hologram technology, as well as access to a variety of specially made ships. There were 4 specific kinds of air and spacecraft primarily used by the Jedi. The Cloud Chaser was known as a lighter-than-air ship meant to cross terrestrial distances. It had a barrel-shaped body with an insect-like wings and a fin on both the top and the bottom. The Pateran Glider was a short-range atmospheric starfighter with wings shaped like our world's pterodactyls. Whenever a Jedi was promoted to a Ranger, they would get their choice between the 2 kinds of interstellar ships that they have on their own. These 2 are known as the Peacemaker-class cruiser or the Hunter-class starfighter. The Hunter is heavily armed and specifically designed for battle. It was noted as being the fastest and the most maneuverable ship class in the Tython system. The Peacemaker is used primarily for travel, including diplomatic missions or interventions. It is capable of fast travel between the planets of the Tython system. While not as nimble as the Hunter was, the Peacemaker was still armed very well for defense, and even for aggressive negotiations. One Ranger, named Lana Ree Brock, noted that the Peacemaker was preferable for longer trips, since it had a lot more room for living space and was not just a simple cockpit. The last thing we want to talk about the Jedi when it comes to their lifestyle is actually marriage. This was back long before this sort of thing was forbidden. While many of the Jedi chose not to marry in order to remain focused on the Force, a lot of them did have families and children. It was from several generations of these families that the Order was often replenished with new members. But the Masters did warn those who married not to allow their feelings of attachment to become jealousy or provoke them into anger, as such things would imbalance them. But now that we've firmly established what life was like on Tython, let us continue with the rest of the Jedi Order's history and foundation. Chapter 3: The Despot War. For almost 10,000 years, the Jedi kept peace and balance in the Tython system. But the first time that we would see a real war and bloodshed on a mass scale was in 25,805 BBY, in an event known as the Despot War. Queen Hadiya of Shikawa began a process of unifying, subjugating the aristocracy of her planet under her rule. She became what is known as the Krall of the Shikawa, and she planned to use her newfound power and authority to bring the rest of the planets in the Tython system under her sole command, including the Jedi. With charisma and promises of safety, she began persuading the masses to her side, proclaiming that the Jedi were mainly those that wanted to control them, to have them rule under their thumb. All those of the noble houses that defied her will were executed. Seeing Hadiya's movements as a threat to peace, the Jedi decided to intervene. But the Mad Queen's pride was not the subject of the Jedi, nor the will of the Force. She decided that her own will would be supreme, and so began the Despot War. The Jedi sided with the Shikawa, most of whom either openly or secretly opposed Hadiya's rule as Krall. There was a short period of war where smaller skirmishes took place on various moons throughout the system and the world of Kalamar. But then, Queen Hadiya launched her real attack, a full assault of Tython with a Despot army that she had trained in secret. At first, the Jedi were taken by utter surprise and shock, but the Order was able to mount an impressive defense against her invasion. The war on Tython lasted at least several months, as the two sides fought brutally against one another. Many of the domed cities on the planet of Nox sided with the Jedi, while others would side with the Queen. When the Jedi discovered the 3 domes around the city of Greenwood Station were supplying Hadiya with weaponry though, they attempted to convince them to stop. But here's where the Jedi Order does something drastic for the first time in their history. When all negotiations failed, the Order resorted to bombing the cities. The Jedi had warned the dome's inhabitants of the incoming bombing, but thousands would still die in the attack. Although the damage would be quickly repaired, many of the inhabitants of Nox would go on to harbor an intense hatred for the Jedi. This was a time before the Jedi Order had figured out the subtleties of proper negotiation. Heretofore, they had only been involved themselves in lower disputes. All in all, the Despot War put them completely out of their depth, and it was showed. The Jedi did a couple of the more questionable things during the war, proving that even they could become desperate. Apparently desperate enough to sire the first of the Terminus. That's right, it seems this infamous creature wasn't entirely a Sith creation, but rather of Jedi alchemy. Master Quang Jang, Headmaster Anil Kesh at the Temple of Science genetically engineered monsters known as the Terminus, whose purpose was to sniff out the Shikawan explosives. However, these experiments would go horrifically wrong and created beasts that had a thirst for Force-sensitive flesh. These are clearly the ancestors of the Terminus, the only difference being that the Terminus are noticeably smaller, perhaps only a little taller than the average humanoid. Nevertheless, they were extremely dangerous, and so it was the Jedi that shipped them all to the moon of Bogan. But one of the most deadly creatures that we have always blamed the Sith for here at the Archives were actually a creation of the very first of the Jedi. Moving on, two members of the Master's Council, Master Tilat and Master Rajavari, became war heroes during this invasion. Rajavari himself won many battles and would earn the nickname of the General, one that stuck with him for the rest of his life, even against his own wishes. Master Tilat was the leader of the Master's Council. He may in fact be what we would call the first Grand Master, though the title did not exist at the time. Unfortunately though, Tilat was slain in battle, thus leading Rajavari's apprentice, Master Ketu, to replace him. As the war raged on, one of the noble houses of Shikawa, Clan Ryo, would openly resist Queen Hadia. She would then execute the leader of Clan Ryo and his oldest son, which would lead the middle son, Volnos Ryo, to take up the title of Baron and lead his house forward. Volnos was unprepared for this mantle and never expected to actually rule, since he was the second of three brothers. The third of his brothers, Hawk Ryo, had actually become a Jedi, and both Volnos' wife and his daughter were Jedi as well. Completely out of his depth and filled with vengeance, Volnos Ryo used his connections with the Order to seek out a man by the name of Dagan Locke. He needed Dagan Locke to formulate a plan that would strike directly at the heart of the Queen. With the help of Volnos, Dagan went to the Despot army, claiming to be a disgraced ranger who wished to join their ranks. He managed to infiltrate their ranks successfully and actually rise to the level of lieutenant, gaining Hadia's trust personally. But during this process, Dagan Locke lost sight of the mission and ended up becoming her lover. He would only be shaken back to his senses after Hadia's ruthless siege of the Temple of Calith, which resulted in a massive casualty event on both sides of the war. Volnos would confront Dagan, remind him of his mission to end the war. Locke, however, was convinced that the huge death toll was technically on his hands for not ending the war sooner, so that night, he ventured into the Queen's tent, one that he now shared with her, to end her life. However, his feelings for her, coupled with the fact that the assassinations were forbidden among the Jedi, made him hesitate. But when the Despot Queen attacked him in return, Dagan Locke slew her and proceeded to fight his way out of the camp. Hadia's death broke the invasion. Their queen dead, this caused the generals to turn on one another, and the Jedi soon defeated the remnants of the Despot army and emerged the official victors of the war. Since this was their first war, they made many mistakes, and the death toll among the Jedi was estimated to be around 100,000, with thousands more injured in the conflict. The Order then dismantled all warships that were constructed during this era, so that they could again seek a state of balance. They then put a much weaker leader on the world of Shikawa, who would not rise up the way that Hadia had. However, in revenge for the bombing of the world of Nox and the domed cities, Greenwood Station sanctioned the murder of a Jedi in return for every 100 civilians who had been killed in the bombings, and the assassinations continued across the system, even 2 to 3 years after the war's end. Public opinion had somewhat turned against the Jedi for the first time, and they were viewed as the villains of the war by many. There was a general sense of resentment towards them by the wider Tython system. Master Rajavari was so disturbed by the events of the war that he laid his weapon down and went into a self-imposed exile, going to one of the thousands of islands surrounding the Temple of Akarkesh in order to meditate peacefully. Master Ketu still occasionally visited Master Rajavari for advice though, as he believed his old mentor's insight to be invaluable. For his role in ending the war, Dagan Locke was promoted to a Jedi Master. But 5 years later, in the year 25,800 BBY, he, along with Hawk Ryo, were prideful after their grand victory, and decided that they would spelunk into the depths of the chasm, and to be the first ones to discover what truly lay at the bottom. But again, the chasm of the world of Tython had a strange interference with the senses of the Jedi, and anyone who ventured too deep went insane. The two disregarded this warning, and went in anyway. But upon venturing into its depths, they were accosted by a terrifying vision of an army of dark warriors wielding blades of fire, marching across Ska Gora. In Dagan Lok's vision, he saw himself wielding one of these blades, leading an army to oppose the invaders. He also saw a gateway that led to thousands of worlds, a new galaxy. The vision drove Dagan Lok insane, driving him eventually to fully embrace the dark side. Ryo managed to push aside the visions and to pull the two of them out of the chasm, rescuing Dagan. When questioned by the Master's Council, Dagan Lok told them of what he had seen and warned them of a coming war, a new threat. However, the Council did not believe in his vision. The Despot Wars had been bad enough, and the after effects were costing the Jedi their very lives. They did not want to consider yet another war, or formulate an army which would only serve to frighten the rest of the system. But Dagan Lok was undeterred. He proclaimed that balance would not avail a second time, and that war would come for them, and the only way to stop it would be embracing the dark side, giving into the strength to fight this distant threat. He believed that they would need the dark side, or they would be utterly destroyed. He would even go as far to develop a strange ability known as Mind Twist, which uses the fears of other beings to manipulate them. As a result, both Dagan Lok and Hawk Ryo were exiled to the moon of Bogan, like many before them, where the two were ordered to meditate, to restore their own inner balance. Master Ketu would later visit his old friend Rajavari on the island to tell him about the vision of Dagan Lok. Master Rajavari decided to backlog this information in his own mind, as he disagreed with the Council's decision to ignore the vision. On Bogan, Hawk Ryo maintained his sanity, convincing himself that he had not seen the vision, or that whatever he had seen had been a lie, a trick of the chasm. Dagan Lok, however, became obsessed with the vision, and continued to pour himself deeper into the dark side, despite all the help that Hawk attempted to give him. Eventually, Ryo was allowed to return to Tython once the Masters had decided that he had restored balance within himself. However, Dagan Lok would remain on the moon for another 7 years, leading us into the next event that would change the course of the Jedi and galactic history forever. Chapter 4, Balance Destroyed. Part 1, Storm on Tython. It is now the year 25,793 BBY, 12 years after the ending of the Despot War, and a new darkness brews on the fringes of space. The Infinite Empire, led by the Rakatan overlords, have journeyed into the deep core and set up a base on the world of Bis. The Rakata were a ruthless ancient species who only used the dark side and lived by ways of conquest, slavery, and cannibalism. They were the first to have any sort of hyperdrive technology in the galaxy too, as it worked by locking onto force-rich planets and then traveling through hyperspace to reach that destination. Using this technology, they were able to build an empire purely around force-based technology, utilizing powerful force-sensitive slaves that they called their hounds. The Rakata located worlds rich in the Force, and then conquered them. They would destroy cities, enslave, or feast on the inhabitants of worlds. Some slaves were used for work, others were placed in batteries that harnessed their rage, pain, in order to fuel the Rakatan engines, powered by the dark side itself. Each overlord, or what the Rakatans called the Predor, had their own personal hound, and Predor Skalnas, the overlord in charge of the contingent that was exploring deep space, had his hound locate a possible world that was rich in the Force. Trill was her name, and she swears that she can feel a powerful world, but she was having an extremely difficult time pinning down the exact location. And so, Skalnas sent for his rivals and subordinates, the Predor Tulkar, and the hound by the name of Zesh. This one has been proven to be the most capable of all of the hounds in the Infinite Empire. Zesh accepted this challenge of locating this supposed world, which sends him on a collision course with Tython and the Jedi. While Zesh travels to the world, he astral projects himself through the Force. In doing this, he was able to scout out Tython to learn of the inhabitants, but a group of 3 Jedi journeyers end up having a strange connection to him through the Force, allowing them to actually perceive his astral form. They believe this to be a vision, and it causes a disruption in each of their activities. The first was a female Dathomiri human by the name of Rakata, a brave but a reckless young one, who was orphaned when her parents were killed during the Despot War. She saw Zesh's projection, and she was attempting to wrangle a spooked Rancor dragon. The second Jedi was Tasha Ryo, a Twi'lek female who was the niece of Hawk Ryo and the daughter of Baron Volnos Ryo. She had refused to take her place as a crime lord's heir, despite her father insistent on demanding that she take up the mantle to rule the clan. She prefers not to use physical weaponry. Instead, she primarily uses hand-to-hand combat in tandem with using her abilities in the Force. She had been in the middle of saving her father from an assassination attempt when she saw this vision. The third Jedi was Seknos Wrath, a male of the Sith pure-blooded species. Seknos comes from a long line of very successful Jedi, giving him a lot to live up to. His grandparents who raised him were legendary masters, who were hard on him for his tendency towards being prideful and bold. He had been showing off his experiments with Force lightning to a group of adoring girls when he saw the vision of Zesh. This caused him to mess up and nearly kill himself using Force lightning. His boasting was interrupted by his grandparents who gave him a stern lecture about using this technique, reminding Seknos of their species' natural inclination towards the dark side. And finally, one other would be able to perceive the Hound's astral projection. That was Degan Locke, who was still trapped on the moon of Bogan. The 3 journeyers followed the Force and ended up converging on one point in the valley. At that moment, a ship crash lands right before them, and the man from their shared vision, the Hound Zesh, emerges from an escape pod. All of the beings, both Rakata and Slave that had been on the ship, were now dead. His mere presence in the dark side was so potent, coupled with the deaths on the ship, that it immediately threw Tython into a violent Force storm. Zesh almost easily dispatched all 3 of the Jedi journeyers. His Force Saber, the archaic version of the lightsaber, sliced straight through their imbued blades, and he reversed all of their Force attacks back onto them. They were each astonished by his raw power, and they almost lost to him entirely. It was a grueling battle, but the Jedi journeyers managed to overwhelm him with their superior numbers and disarmed him of the Force Saber. Now without his weapon, Zesh fled into the abyss of Ra, a deep place on Tython filled with simmering acid pools and incredibly dangerous creatures. The 3 Jedi journeyers decided to chase him into that abyss, and following their trail were 3 superior Jedi, which included Master Quan Jang and Hawk Ryo. Within the abyss, Zesh finds himself chased by the ghosts of people that he has murdered. It turns out that he has been the one to sabotage the ship upon arrival, and that he slaughtered every being on board, including his own Predor master. However, due to his injuries, a concussion which rendered him unable to remember why he had done this, soon he found himself fighting off Tython's native fauna, those that were able to absorb his Force abilities. While Zesh managed to take down a pack of canine predators, he soon found himself facing off against a Sarl, one of Tython's giant worms, which could apparently breathe Force lightning. Without his weapon, the Force Saber, he was practically at its mercy. This was until Rakata, Seknos Wrath, and Tasha Ryo arrived, distracting the worm by hurling rocks at it, saving the Force Hound's life. However, being only journeyers without weapons, they were unable to affect it. Shay, though, still had Zesh's Force Saber and didn't know how to properly activate it. This was a weapon that could only be ignited when one channeled the dark side of the Force. Because of this, Zesh convinced Shay to give him back his weapon, as only he could use it properly. Taking a chance, she threw him the saber, but as soon as he got it, he abandoned the Jedi and decided to watch what they would do in the face of the threat. Being a Hound of Rakata, he only knew one thing: you take no mercy on enemies, and you cull out the weak. His entire perspective on the universe was formed around the principle of the strongest ruling. He literally knew no other way. So when he saw that the Jedi were protecting one another whenever they were put down by the worm, he was shocked. First, Tasha fell, and then Seknos. Zesh expected Shay to allow the worm to eat her companions while she ran, since that is what he would have done. But instead, he sensed her purge all fear from her body, begin to glow with a luminous light within the Force as she stepped in front of her fallen friends. Zesh was moved by her light, and jumped into the battle to fight alongside her. The superior Jedi who had been tracking them had now finally arrived. While the Rangers, Shay and Zesh, finished off the worm, Master Quan Jang melded his mind with the other masters around Tython in order to attempt to restore balance to the planet and bring an end to the storm. However, they discovered that Zesh was the epicenter of the storm, and it was feeding off of his darkness, and he was in turn feeding off of it. The Jedi attempted to get the Hound to stand down, but instead, he stood his ground against them, refusing to be defeated by an enemy until he was dead. He even manipulated the storm to strike at the Jedi with a bolt of lightning. Shay, believing that her master could be dead because of Zesh, attacked him and took his Force Saber. Feeling enraged, she managed to activate the weapon and poised to strike down the Hound. However, Zesh was weakened by his many injuries and accepted his death. He mentioned to her that whenever they eat his body, they should get the honor portion, his heart, because he had fought so bravely in life. For this was the Rakatan way whenever they defeated their enemy. The very odd request shook Shay out of her rage as she lowered the saber, telling him that such a thing was not the Jedi way. His confusion doubling, Zesh then passed out from pain. The Jedi took him back to the Temple of Healing, Martynas, to have his wounds patched up. This entire time, Zesh was culture shocked by the fact that they were not murdering him. In fact, he didn't even know what a healer was. Tasha Ryo would end up visiting him in his cell in order to help him recover and to maintain his lost memories. Upon accessing his mind though, she learned everything about the incoming Rakatan forces. She also learned the duty of the Force Hounds, and was horrified by their service. Master Ketu and several members of the council arrived at the hospital and decided that the safest thing to do was to banish Zesh to Bogan so that he did not throw Tython out of balance again. Hawk Ryo, who had experienced being exiled himself, encouraged the Hound to spend his time meditating on Ashla so that he could find balance and return. However, Zesh mentioned that their view of the Force was much different than his, as he only knew the ways of darkness. And upon the moon of Bogan, Dagan Lok senses Zesh's arrival, and knew that his vision was soon coming to fruition. Part 2. A slave weapon liberated. 2 months pass after these events. The Jedi are studying the Force Hound's Force Saber to understand its functionality. It appears to be indestructible, unaffected by the hottest forges or the coldest coolant. The Vertep headmaster, Mad Dog, notices that it doesn't have a power switch and can't discern the purpose of the crystal. The 3 journeyers and Hawk Ryo are present for the study. Ryo, having spent time on Bogan, understands the nature of the dark side better than most. He ends up igniting it and discovers that in order to properly use the weapon, one must shift their own internal balance to channel the dark side. But maintaining the blade continues to draw one deeper into the darkness. It is a powerful, but an incredibly dangerous weapon. Master Mad Dog allows Hawk to keep the weapon so that he may experiment on it to better understand it. While this is happening, Master Ketu goes to visit Rajavari once more, enlighten him on the recent events to get his wisdom and guidance. The 2 masters have a conversation wherein Rajavari chastises his former student, not heeding the journeyer's vision the same way that the council did not heed Dagan Lok's. Ketu, though, maintains that the Jedi don't want to sound war drums over simple visions, but Rajavari rebutes this. The glimpses of the Force must be followed at all costs. He forces Master Ketu to confront the truth about why the council was ignoring the vision, because if they were true, then everything the Jedi know would come to an end. They would have to confront the fact that they weren't the only knowledgeable Force wielders in the galaxy, and that they had needlessly sentenced Dagan Lok to a 12-year imprisonment. Master Rajavari encourages Ketu to find out who Zesh is and what he knows. Meanwhile, the Hound and Dagan Lok had a meetup on the world of Bogan. Lok showed the newcomer how he managed to trick the guard droids by manipulating his prison cuffs. He then divulges his story, learning that Zesh was not only the figure from the vision, but that he possessed the knowledge of how to create the Force Saber, or the Sword of Fire that Dagan Lok had seen in his visions. The Dark Jedi now believed that if they could get Zesh to create a saber, then he could show it to the Masters and to prove that his vision was true. The 2 of them escaped Bogan, using a ship that had been down during the Despot War. Zesh charged the power cells with his Force lightning to get it back into commission, and the 2 departed for the planet of Krev Koer, first to find a proper crystal, and then to the world of Nox afterwards to get the construction material to create the Force Saber. Back on Tython, receiving an alert that the prisoners had escaped, a team of Jedi consisting of Shay Koda, Hawk Ryo, Seknos Wrath, and 3 other Rangers went on to investigate. After fighting off the Tarenta on the Dark Moon and investigating the prisoners' living quarters, they found that Dagan Lok had carved images of himself holding the Force Saber into the wall. They also found evidence of the repaired ship. Hawk, knowing how his old friend thinks, deduces that he's going to attempt to recreate the Force Saber, and so the team follows the 2 Dark Jedi to the world. On the glassy planet, Seknos and 2 other Rangers engage Locke and Zesh, but the battle doesn't go well for them at all. One of the Rangers succumbs to Dagon's mind twist, making her believe that she is on fire, and Dagon defeats the other 2 in sword combat. After a brief duel with Zesh, Seknos ends up sacrificing himself to save one of the other Rangers, resulting in him plummeting down a deep pit. However, he does survive his fall against all odds, and is nursed back to health by the unlikeliest of people, Trill, the Force Hound of Skal Nas, who had been ordered to follow Zesh. On the planet Nox, Dagon, Locke, and Zesh arrive and infiltrate a manufacturing facility. Once again, Locke uses his mind tricks to subdue the owner, while Zesh crafts them both their each Force Saber. Utilizing alchemy and the crystals that they had picked up on the world, the material of the machinery found on Nox, he forges their new weapons of frozen fire. Although Zesh was always taught this was the weapon of a slave, he sees now that Dagon Locke views it as an image of power and authority. Just like himself, it is a weapon that has been freed of the shackles, given a greater destiny. A destiny that he has no idea will reshape the galaxy forever. But now that Locke has his tool from his vision, he believes that it will make much more to convince the Jedi to follow his path. He ominously states that it will take an army, but that Locke knows where to find one. He ends up assembling the inner circle of Queen Hadia, all of her top generals and lieutenants from the Despot War, which had been banished to the world of Nox. He convinces them all to follow him as their leader. This time, not to destroy the Jedi, but to save them from themselves, and prepare for the coming dark army that he has seen in his vision. But quickly behind them is the other half of the Jedi strike team, Shae Koda, Hawk Ryo, and Rory Fenn. So the Dark Ones split and work to flee from their captors. Hawk Ryo catches up with Dagon Locke on the edge of a bridge and confronts him with Zesh's old Force Saber. The 2 ignite their blades and have a brief duel, making this technically the first lightsaber duel within the Jedi Order. However, it is also technically not, since it turns out that the man that Hawk is fighting is just an illusion cast within his mind, while the real Dagon escapes. Elsewhere, an enraged Shae catches up to Zesh, believing that he has killed Seknos. Although they begin to duel, Zesh is holding back, warning her to walk away as he does not wish to kill her. However, their duel is interrupted when a giant Dianoga grabs Shae and drags her into the murky depths of the lake below. Against his better judgment, Zesh dives in after her in order to save her life. Seknos ends up making contact with Hawk Ryo, proving himself to be alive. Hawk, now knowing Dagon's plan, heads to his homeworld of Shikawa. A lot of the old Despot sympathizers still existed there, and that would be where Zesh and Locke would try to recruit more for their army. Seknos and Trill, who had concealed her true nature in the Force in order to hide from the Jedi, met up with the rest of the Jedi and snuck into Shikawa in order to find the 2 Darksiders. The final showdown happens where Hawk Ryo and Dagon Locke duel for real, while Seknos and Zesh get their rematch. A rematch that the Sith pureblood still loses. As a Force Hound, Zesh is far more powerful and skilled than any Jedi journeyer. Shae Koda, who had been put in a trance by Dagon Locke, snaps out of it whenever he injures Ryo. Shae manages to convince Zesh that Locke was only using him, just as the Rakata had. The Hound eventually turns against him, and Locke makes the mistake of trying to enter his mind and manipulate him like he had many others. But he quickly discovers that Zesh's mind is not a place where he wants to be. The crushing darkness of Zesh's mental scape incapacitates the Dark Jedi, ending the hunt at last. While this was occurring, Tasha Ryo had been on Tython attempting to learn about the truth of the Rakata. Soon all would be revealed when she discovered an ancient holocron, not of the origin of the Jedi. This holocron was created by the Kwa of Dathomir. From it, she learned that long ago they had harnessed the power of the Force to create what is known as the Infinity Gates, giant portals that could transport one from any point in the galaxy to another. They then used these gates to connect with other species, to teach them the ways of the Force, and to develop relationships with them. They did the same thing when they had stumbled upon the Rakatan homeworld of Lihon. However, what they didn't know was that the Rakata were an evil people that ate their own and only cared for domination and power. Many considered them worse than the Sith. By the time that the Kwa species discovered their true nature, it was far too late, and the Rakata had used the Kwa's knowledge and gifts of technology to create Force-based ships and weapons of mass destruction. These were used purely for conquest, creating what is known as the Infinite Empire. This is the first true threat of the Jedi Order. The Rakata turned their sights on taking the Qua's Infinity Gates to make their empire unstoppable, but the Qua fought back to the very last man before destroying many of their Infinity Gates as possible, believing that it was better that they be destroyed than fall into the hands of the Rakata. But one still existed somewhere buried, on none other than the world of Tython, and now one of the Rakatan Praetors by the name of Skalnas was seeking it out, hoping to use its power to reverse a strange phenomenon, one that was causing the Rakata to rapidly lose their connection to the Force. Meanwhile, Master Rajavari and Ketu learned the information from Tasha, and Ketu ordered preparations to be made for war. There was no denying it anymore. Dagon Lock's vision was now coming to pass. Part 3. Fury of the Force Saber. 1 year passes from this point. During this time, the Infinite Empire have invaded the Tython system. They begin by attacking the outpost of the Fury's Gate, and then taking the gas giants Obri and Mar, along with their moons. They continued their march across the system, but met a strong defense on Tython itself, as the Jedi repelled their initial attack and forced them to fall back to Skagora. Every world that the Rakata attacked, they either enslaved the population or left it in utter ruin. At last, the Jedi decided to use Zesh's knowledge and mass-produce the Force Saber on a huge level, giving it to the whole of the Order. This was the only weapon to prevail against the Rakata before. They had to accept the risk of channeling the dark side, or die. Not only this, but they made a deal with Dagon Lock to have him once more lead the armies of the Jedi. It took time for them to get used to the new weapon, as they functioned and handled much different than their metal swords did. But Zesh taught them how to wield it properly. In a shocking turn, Master Rajavari comes out of exile and resumes his title as the General, heading the combined forces of the Jedi and the armies of the remaining settled worlds under the Rakatan control. But the secret weapon helping the Jedi out most was the use of what is known as seers. Those that use clairvoyance and interpret dreams and visions to the divine in order to learn where their enemy would strike next. Tasha Ryo, who had now been promoted to a Jedi Ranger, along with the other Journeyer friends, happens to be one of these seers. While the Rakata was having a great deal of trouble attacking Tython directly, they decided to take a new approach, sending their first wave of attackers known as the Flesh Raiders to the world of Shikawa. The Flesh Raiders were brutish, mutated specimens of their own species, bred purely for war. The Jedi meet them in the battle, wearing their newly crafted imbued armor and riding upon their Rancor dragons. Zesh now fights on their side and must face down many of the Force Hounds that he has betrayed, but they are hardly a challenge for him. Zesh was always the most skilled of the Hounds, but little does he know that even though he is an ally of the Jedi now, his memory loss was more than just a concussion. It is revealed by the Praetor that they used the Force to turn him into a sleeper agent without him even knowing it, and that this has been the reason for his betrayal of the Rakata, the reason that he had crashed the ship in the first place. He did not even remember his old rival in the Force Hounds, Trill, who was now an undercover agent among the Tythons and the Jedi. The Jedi fought ruthlessly in this engagement. The Flesh Raiders do not understand the concept of surrender, and they would fight till they were all dead. So the Jedi gave up on the tenets of mercy on their enemy. They fight on, losing the balance that they had so carefully cultivated until this moment. The requirement of the Force Sabers even drawing them deeper into the darkness, until finally they won the battle, and they drove the Rakata off of Shikawa. The Sith pureblood Seknos despises the Force Saber. The war they now fight is nothing like the one of glory and honor that his ancestors had fought in. He feels himself and his allies being pushed off the brink of balance, and this concept disgusts him. But he also knows that there is nothing to be done, not until the Rakata are completely finished. The Jedi formulate a plan to strike at the heart of the Infinite Empire, directly at the heart of the Praetor Skalnas himself. Once again using the astral projection ability, Zesh manages to locate their hidden base on Skagora, and the Jedi prepare for attack. Despite the Jedi attempting to strike, Trill had been keeping Skalnas updated on their movements, and the Rakata laid a trap on their world. One that succeeded in capturing the Jedi forces, including Dagon Lock and Seknos. The Rakata placed them within the battery cells of their ship, drawing upon the pain and hatred of each captured being to provide power to their machines. Zesh and Trill attempted to mount a rescue mission inside of the base, but Trill reveals herself as a traitor and stops Zesh, attacking him when his back was turned, incapacitating him. The other Jedi continued to battle the Flesh Raider army on the surface of Skagora, further scarring the once untouched beauty of the world and sinking themselves deeper in the dark side. Here something tragic begins to take hold. The Jedi begin to enjoy killing their enemy, and go out of their way to seek more death upon their foes, following the Force Saber's temptation and the whispers of the dark side. While being held captive by the Rakata, Predor, Skalnas tortures Zesh until he gains his memory back and remembers that he was a plant all along. The former Hound is horrified at the realization that all of his friends, and even the relationship that he has forged with Shay, it is all a lie. Zesh had been a traitor himself, with the purpose of learning the secrets of the Jedi, divulging their weaknesses to Skalnas, all for the purpose of the Rakata being able to exploit them, to use them as slaves. Now once again a Force Hound for the Infinite Empire, Zesh divulges that the Jedi are using seers to predict their movements, and under the Predor's orders, he tortures Dagan Lok with his own Mind Twist ability, extracting the truth of his vision from long ago. The reason the chasm of Tython interferes with the minds of the Jedi is revealed, because at the very bottom is the location of the Qua Infinity Gate. Zesh also projects himself through the Force again, and blinds the sight of all of the seers, and by blinding them, he both burned their physical eyes out, and cut them off from the Force entirely. Luckily though, before their sight was burned out completely, Tasha Ryo was granted one final vision. The vision saw that the Rakata would attack the Temple of Anil Kesh, which lay over the chasm. As the Jedi learned that Zesh was now a traitor, they recalled what remained of their forces back to Tython to prepare for the inevitable invasion of the Rakata. The Rakata did indeed come, and ventured to the Jedi home planet. The fight begins both in orbit and in the atmosphere, as well as on the ground. Force sabers clash, teeth gnash, and both sides are filled with a lust for blood. The Jedi have now wholly given themselves over to the dark side. There is no longer a balance. Their minds are consumed with hatred. All they feel is the desire to shed the blood of their enemy. Tython reacts in turn, violently, unleashing its storms and earthquakes, but it does nothing to quell the savage fighting. The world itself begins to be torn asunder. The Jedi unleash all of their alchemical monsters from the pens of Anil Kesh, sending them to the Rakata hordes in order to feast. On the Rakatan capital ship, Seknos fully gives into his hatred and frees himself, as well as the slaves from their battery cells. The Sith pureblood, filled with a rage that he has never felt before, consumed by darkness entirely, the same darkness that he has avoided for so long. The Sith pureblood leads a slave revolt and works to rejoin the battle on Tython. The Force itself begins to cry out in pain and desperation. Zesh and Skalnash pull Dagan Lok along with the chains into the chasm so that they can find the Infinity Gate. Using ancient Rakatan knowledge, the Predor is able to bypass the wall that causes all Force sensitives to lose their minds. He leaves Dagan Lok for dead there, while he and the Hound venture inside. Shay Koda then arrives just in time to see Dagan Lok having freed himself from his chains and fighting off a horde of flesh raiders with 2 stolen Force sabers. The Jedi refuses to fall. Shay and Dagan both plunge into the chasm in order to stop the Rakatan overlord's grand plan and to put an end to Zesh. On the surface of the world, Seknos faces down Trill and defeats her in combat. The Sith is about to unleash a massive wave of Force lightning that would surely incinerate her as his eyes begin to turn a burning yellow. However, Master Quan Jang shouts at Seknos to remember who he is, that he is greater than his fury and his darkness, that he is a Jedi. Pulling himself out of the depths of darkness, the Sith pureblood conquers his people's penchant for Bogan and fires his Force lightning straight into the sky with a howl of rage, sparing the life of the Force Hound Trill. By his actions, he proves that the Sith people are capable of overcoming their nature when they care enough about the good inside of them, to listen to the Ashla, the light. This was the way of balance that the Jedi had maintained for so long successfully, but now, as with Tython, the balance was being quickly destroyed. Now deep within the chasm, Dagan Lok and Shay arrive to face down Zesh and the Predor Skalnas. Dagan duels the Rakatan overlord, but decides to use his signature Mind Twist ability, attacking him in his mindscape. But just like Zesh, he discovers that entering a Rakatan's mind was a place of true savagery and darkness. He was accosted by screams of all of the beings that the Predor had eaten. The Rakatan takes this opportunity to stab Lok before activating the Infinity Gate and basking in the pathway to the universe. Ultimate power. Meanwhile, Shay duels the man that had become her lover, and she does everything she can to remind Zesh of the truth. Despite what the Rakata had done to his mind, she knew that he knew the truth. He had come to know love, and he had tasted the light. He no longer had to be a slave, but Zesh could choose to be a free man. Zesh was reminded of all of this, all of the death that he had once brought. He was filled with pain, sadness, regret. he did not believe himself to be the man that Shay did. But his world was destroyed once again when Kota lowered her weapon and said that she had forgiven him. In that moment, Skalnas blasted her in the back with force lightning and screamed at Zesh that love was a lie, that there was nothing in the universe but power, and that he was a slave. This causes the Hound to fly into a dark fury, to rebel against his Rakatan overlords, once and for all. On the surface, Tasha Ryo hasn't given up trying to restore balance to Tython despite being blinded by the Force. The gatekeeper of the Qua holocron informs her of a failsafe that has been employed should the Rakata ever find the Infinity Gate again. But the process required the use of the Tho Yor and the sacrifice of a Jedi seer. Although she was blinded to the Force, the holocron gatekeeper informed Tasha that blinded did not mean severed, and that the Force still flowed through her. However, this process would cost her her life. Going into a meditative state, Tasha Ryo accepted her destiny and was opened up to the Force once more. Her very essence was transferred into the Tho Yor, which floated above the temple of Anil Kesh. In her final moments, her sight was restored and she was able to perceive exactly who had created the Tho Yor and why they had done so. The ancient ship then glowed with a bright beacon of energy and shot a beam down into the chasm to permanently close the Infinity Gate. At the gate, Zesh and Skalnas had been in a fierce duel. The distraction caused by the closure of the portal distracted the Predator well enough for Zesh to strike a decisive blow, cutting him across the midsection, ending the Overlord's life. Luckily for him, Shay Kota was not dead, and apparently neither was Dagon Locke. The three of them all managed to escape the depths of the chasm before the Infinity Gate detonated permanently, thus ending this section of the lore. And now we reach Chapter 5, the birth of the Jedi. The victory was short-lived. In the aftermath of the Rakata's defeat, they lost their only hope to saving their species from being cut off to the Force. It wasn't too long after this that the Infinite Empire began to disintegrate everywhere in the rest of the galaxy. Sentient life on various planets took old Rakatan technology and reverse engineered it to invent the first hyperdrives and to achieve hyperspace travel. Shay Kota and the former Force Hound Zesh, who now goes by the name of Tau, got a happy ending in the end. He would join the Jedi and go on his own journey across Tython, learning more about Ashla and connecting to the light. Meanwhile, the Council all agreed to lay aside their Force sabers as they saw what it had done to the members of their ranks. They had all felt the distinct shift to the dark side and were able to come back from the brink of it. The weapon skewed the balance far too much, but the one person who didn't agree was Dagon Locke. Dagon mentioned that the Flesh Raiders were still left on Tython and that the Rakata could come back in the future. He refused to put down his Force saber or be returned to the moon of Bogan, and he went off to train his own following, which consisted of the all-liberated slaves from the Rakatan ship, those that refused to abandon the dark side. Breaking from the cast for a moment, we now jump to a different story happening in the same year, surrounding a different Jedi Ranger. The Ranger's name is Lenori Brock. He had actually been away from Tython for quite a long time, as she was one of those Rangers that rarely visited the homeworld, and she had not participated in the system-wide Rakatan War. In the wake of the Swarms of Darkness though, a new cult had arisen somewhere in the Tythos system, with a brand new leader that opposed the Jedi way. The Master Council recalled Brock back to Tython and entrusted her with this mission, because the cult leader was her own brother. Dalian Brock had been born without the talent of the Force, unlike his parents and his sister. He had failed his Jedi trials and had grew disillusioned, feeling as an outcast, thought to be dead. He now emerged many years later with a radical departure from the Jedi's teachings. He is now obsessed with traveling beyond the reaches of known space, bent on opening a hyperspace rift using dark matter as the key. This risked a cataclysmic reaction that would consume the entire system. Lenori would go on a journey throughout the Tythos system to learn her brother's plan and to stop his mad machinations. All the while, she was dealing with the fact that she had thought that he was dead, but now having to bring an end to him herself. The Jedi discovers that his plan is to tear open a gate into hyperspace at the cost of Tython itself. It was both a way to leave the system and to get revenge on the people that he had felt had abandoned him. Lenori accepted that her brother had totally lost his mind now and faced no other choice. She took his life to stop the impending disaster. Unfortunately, just like all other Jedi, she would find no rest when she returned to Tython. What awaited her was the after effects of the invasion. The stink of the dark side reeked on Tython's surface, and her own balance was disrupted by the killing of her own brother, her blood, and it would continue to be disrupted in the coming era. The dark times had now only just begun. While both the Despot Wars and the invasion of Tythos had only lasted a single year each, they were wars which had left terrible lasting effects on the Jedi, and they were about to plunge headfirst into a war which would drag out for the next 10 years. Something far worse. Unlike the previous two wars, not much is recorded about the time known as the Force Wars, but it was instigated by the followers of Dagan Locke, our once hero who returned to take over the ways of the Jedi, and to run things his new, enlightened, darker way. Now having found themselves entirely devoted to the dark side, they called themselves the Bogan Jedi. In an effort to maintain balance, the remaining members of the Order had to throw themselves deeply into the light, becoming the Ashla Jedi. They wielded upgraded versions of the Force-imbued sword, one that could at least contend with Force sabers of the Bogan, though the history is a bit muddled as to the art that they displayed both using the size of regular swords as well as the Force sabers, so the timeline of weapon progression is a bit unclear in the lore here. Our best theory is the knowledge of how to actually create the Force sabers was known to Zesh alone, as well as to the Vertep headmaster Mad Dog, both of whom had sided with the Ashla Jedi, and as a result, the Force sabers of the Bogan Jedi were limited to what could be scavenged in the aftermath, what they could find that the Rakata had left behind. This led some to be able to use them, and others being forced to use old bladed weapons. But interestingly, at some point, a brilliant Jedi weapons master whose name has now been lost to history unfortunately, managed to construct the first lightsaber. Aptly, it was called the First Blade. While it was a type of proto-saber, it had an internal power cell and did not require the use of the dark side to activate. This was the basis by which all future lightsabers would be constructed, and it was tens of millennia ahead of its time. However, feeling the implications of the weapon, the master hid it away, only to be found by one that was worthy. During the Force Wars, the Ashla Jedi fell almost entirely to the light, where they forgot the balance that had once defined their very way of life. Seeing light as the only way to counterbalance the dark, they reorganized themselves into the Holy Order of the Jedi Knights, officially becoming Jedi. Master Rajavari, Garen Jard, Master Ketu, and several others would become together to form a new kind of council which would govern over the Jedi Order. Their main goal, defend against the dark side. This would become the very first High Council. At some point, Dagan Locke would be slain in battle, leaving a few of his followers behind, as it seemed like peace was once again well within grasp. But there was another. Rajavari had been growing even closer to the dark side than his fellow Jedi. He despised that the Jedi had fallen purely to the light, and he believed that the Order needed to be completely remade, overhauled from the ground up. But first, it needed to be obliterated. He would lead a section of Jedi students into the dark side, and establish a set key of principles for his students to live by, all of which ran contrary to the Jedi's established virtues. While we don't know each of them in order, we do know of their second principle: all life is a battle, even to the last breath. And the seventh principle, to sacrifice strength, is the act of a fool. Both of these seem to be projects of Rajavari's trauma from the previous wars. The second principle shows the extremist survival mentality, and the seventh principle shows how he has rejected the Jedi way of self-sacrifice after seeing how many of the Jedi had died doing so. However, it was the fifth principle which remains the most controversial. Mercy creates a spiral of destruction. He witnessed this take place during the war with the Rakata and with Dagan Locke, and how he had continued to cause problems despite all of his chances. And so the Force Wars continued, with the once war hero, founder of the Jedi Council Rajavari, helming the dark side forces. During this period of time, they would establish the Fount of Rajavari, a place where he stored all of his most precious and dangerous knowledge. It was a safe house of his principles and guidance to be inherited by a worthy heir. He would seek out the First Blade and claim it for himself to use during the war. He also inscribed the location of the Font of Rajavari into the hilt, so that a worthy seeker would one day find it and be led to enlightenment. But the day would come when Rajavari and his Dark Jedi would meet their end. After nearly a decade of fighting amongst themselves, the Force Wars would come to a close in 25,783 BBY. Rajavari and his students would follow the second principle, fight until the very last breath. Their final stand would come when they were held up in the Temple of Caliph, making it their final fortress. The now Jedi Order laid siege to the fortress for a long period of time, until Rajavari finally fell in battle. His students all refused to surrender even after their master had fallen, deciding to adhere to his principles even till death, and his students were picked off one by the Jedi, refusing to submit. This, however, would not be the end to the story of Master Rajavari. as he was so powerful that he had learned to keep himself from joining with the Force permanently. He had become a Force ghost of sorts, and his spirit lingered in the hidden font of Rajavari, awaiting the day that a worthy disciple would arrive and become the heir to his knowledge. By the end of this terrible war, the planet Tython had had enough. The storms never ceased because of the hideous imbalance caused by the Jedi and the Dark Jedi. Soon the inhabitants of Tython would wish that lightning and earthquakes were the least of their worries. Soon, a terrible cataclysm occurred which practically tore the planet apart, obliterating its biosphere and making the world officially uninhabitable. What few Jedi survived these events were forced to flee from the ancestral homeworld. No one in the Tython system seemed to want to be there anyway, so it wasn't like they could go out and do anything with the planets that they had spent so long defending. They were exiles. And so, with their new hyperdrive technology, the Jedi departed the deep core and left for the rim of the galaxy, thus ending an incredibly tragic period of time. Chapter 6. The Guardians of the Republic. The Jedi Order would wander listless, attempting to find somewhere to call home, and during that time, balance in the Force would leave them entirely. But you see, it wasn't out of arrogance or negligence that they did this, as the later writers of the Sith would have you believe. The dark side had taken everything from the Jedi. Emotions such as anger and hatred drove them to make innocents suffer. They had manipulated life to create horrible monsters that should have never existed, and they had bombed innocent cities for the purposes of war. The Rakata showed how the dark side made one hungry for conquest, for blood, for power. The Force Sabers had drawn them even closer to the darkness, compromising their values, and the dark side had made one of their greatest members believe that survival of the fittest was the only way that the Jedi would thrive and continue. The Jedi was not just a religion or an order, it had been a family. They were Tythons, bonded by a familial kinship in the Force with the ancestry that ran deep into the Order. But the dark side had taken that from them. They left Tython with their hands stained red from the blood of their family, those that they had to slaughter because of the curse of the dark side. And now, Tython was in ruins. The place that the Tho Yor had brought them all together, the place that they had fought tooth and nail to defend, the only place they ever called home. In this day of heartbreak, the idea of balance or any semblance of compromise with the dark, with the Bogan, was a cruel joke to the grieving Jedi Order. But no longer. They would serve the peaceful, life-giving Ashla, devote themselves entirely to the service of defending life, being a shield of the innocent. With this decision came the new code and the new meaning. There is no emotion, there is peace. This principle guides all meditations and interactions with others. It reaffirms the Jedi ideal to act without recklessness, and to view the actions of others through the pure lens of the unifying force. There is no ignorance, there is knowledge. Those who don't understand this precept are quick to fear, as ignorance leads to fear, which leads to the dark side. There is no passion, there is serenity. A subtle extension of the first precept. This reminder to act dispassionately in every deliberation extends to personal obsessions, and is a reminder not to elevate the self above the mission and the order. There is no chaos, there is harmony. Those who cannot see the threads of the Force unifying all life together in existence as random and without purpose. But the Jedi are different. The Jedi perceive the structure, the will of the galaxy in a beautiful tapestry. There is no death, there is the Force. All things die, but the Force lives on. The Jedi believe that as beings who exist as shades of the Force, the end of existence is not to be overly mourned. They understand that they are a part of an energy larger than themselves. They play roles in a cosmic fabric that is greater than one's understanding. This is the code, as explained by the Jedi. For 730 years, the Jedi sailed among the stars. The stories and emotions of Tython faded to the annals of history, and it wasn't until the year 25,053 that they would come upon a new world in wild space. A world much like Tython, rich in the Force, only lacking its fierce storms. Originally, the world was known as Idux, when it was under the control of Zim the Despot. But when it welcomed the Jedi with open arms, they would call the world Ossus. The Jedi would bring over many traditions from Tython, establishing a forge to continue making their weapons, their metal blades. They had lost the first blade on Tython, but they still remembered the strange sabers of old and from myth. From that day on, they would work towards recreating the frozen laser technology, eventually bringing into being the lightsaber. But this would not happen for many thousands of years. For now, their trusty swords remained with them, a reminder of their origins. On Ossus, they established an academy for the Jedi and made the centerpiece of the planet a great, beautiful library. They kept all the knowledge they had rescued from Tython there, and luckily, they had not lost anything in the move. They continued to collect information from the galaxy around them, filling this great library to the brim and making it the greatest source of knowledge in the entire ancient galaxy. Soon, they would even make contact with other worlds around them, including the planet of Kamas. The world was home to the Kamasi species, who were known for their friendship and hospitality. In fact, they were so well known for being agreeable that the world of Kamasi came to mean friend from afar, or stranger to be trusted in various languages. They were renowned for their skills in diplomacy and meditation, able to use wisdom and social acumen to settle disputes between powerful systems. The Jedi, not wishing to recreate the mistakes of the Tython system, learned diplomacy and morality at the feet of the Kamasi, and thus, legend has it that it was here that the Jedi became the legendary diplomats that would use their words before their weapon. But now, across the galaxy in the core worlds that we know, the Unification Wars were raging on. Surprisingly, little is known about this war, except for the warlord known as Zakranand Minus, who was generally painted as the villain. The Jedi took notice of Minus's villainy and decided to take part in the war, deeming his ways to be evil and wrong. This is important because this is one of their first interactions with the core worlds. Following these wars, several planets such as Coruscant, Corellia, Alderaan, and Duro would all come together to form what is known as the Galactic Republic. In this year, all the founders signed the Galactic Constitution, but despite their aid in the war, the Jedi were still somewhat wary of interacting with any established governments and worlds, considering how the Tython system had utterly turned on them. And so, the Jedi kept their distance from the Republic. The people of the Republic paid little attention to the Jedi way, just seeing them as a large sect of mystics and ancient wizards. But finally, in the year 24,953 BBY, there was a period of great expansion and exploration. Duro scouts had found a new trade route and a hyperspace lane linking Coruscant directly to Ossus. When they landed on Ossus, they would come into contact with the Jedi Order officially and would meet with the Grand Master at the time by the name of Han Tyr. Tyr spent much time with the representatives of the Republic, saw how promising the future of this new system actually was, as it had the potential to bring peace to the galaxy, and thrust it into an age of progression and unity. Tyr eagerly returned to the world of Ossus, and with his arrival, it was followed by several weeks of debate, meditation among the rest of the Jedi. Some members of the Council were against joining the Republic, others were for it. It was around this time that there was also some trouble brewing between the Tython cluster and that of the Hutt Empire. Trouble that was aimed right at the fledgling Republic. Since Ossus happened to be poised right between the two of them, it was the perfect line of defense. At this point, the Jedi Order would officially choose to join the Republic, not to be a part of the government, but to serve as the silent but their watchful guardians. It was a task that they would soon prove themselves in, with the coming of the Terminus War. But that, my friends, is a story for another day. And with that, the dawn of the Jedi. When the Tho Yor brought them all together, they were merely beings that wanted answers concerning the life-giving energy that they could all feel around them. They begat an entire culture of those students, those that sought the balance between the light and the dark, guided by a living planet and 2 moons, all of which teaching them this concept. They began as simple scholars, monks, but quickly found their permanent role as guides, protectors in a small region of space. But years upon years of war, devastation, and corruption both within and outside caused them to abandon the way of balance out of fear, agony for what the dark side had created, what it had done to them. Never wishing the destruction and pain upon anyone else, the Jedi Order dedicated themselves to ensuring that the rest of the galaxy could grow in peace, now under the watchful banner of the Republic. The Jedi were not perfect. Just like any being, Force-sensitive or not, they were deeply flawed. But that's what I think makes them deeply interesting. But whether in balance or adhering to the light, the Jedi only ever wanted to protect the sanctity of life, even when that cost came at their own, and reached to their homes, friends, and even their happiness. But this is the beginning of a long history of service, of sacrifice to the Republic, and to the will of the Force. The light of the Jedi. It was the beginning of stories of heroes of bravery, such as Anakin Skywalker, Luke Skywalker, Kyle Katarn, Mara Jade, Obi-Wan Kenobi, Grandmaster Yoda, and many, many more. It is the beginning of a story that will live forever. It was the awakening of the light. It was the dawn of the Jedi. And with that, thank you so much for watching today's video, and as always, may the Force be with you.